The morning began like any other, coffee brewing, the faint hum of the street outside, and the soft chirping of the two sparrows that had made a nest under my front porch awning. But something new stood out, taped to my front door in a garish yellow envelope. In bold black print across the top were the words, "Violation notice. Immediate action required." It was the unmistakable stamp of my HOA, and I had a sinking feeling before I even opened it. The letter claimed that my exterior security cameras were unsightly and in violation of neighborhood aesthetic guidelines. It instructed me to remove them immediately, or face daily fines that would quickly snowball into hundreds of dollars. I read the paragraph twice, not because I didn't understand the accusation, but because I couldn't believe it was happening. Those cameras weren't decorative. They were a necessity. They had been installed after a series of small thefts around the neighborhood, flower pots missing, packages gone from doorsteps, even the disappearance of a neighbor's garden hose. At first, I wondered if this was a case of overzealous enforcement, but the letter carried an oddly personal tone. The phrasing wasn't the standard legal jargon the HOA typically used. It felt targeted, almost like someone wanted my cameras gone for a reason. The thought lingered in my mind like a bad smell, and by the time I finished my coffee, I knew I wouldn't be taking them down. Later that week, the concerns escalated. Another notice appeared, this time warning me that refusal to comply could result in legal action. My neighbors began asking me questions. Some were curious. Others were quietly supportive. A few looked uneasy, as if they were worried about being seen talking to me. It didn't take long for rumors to start circulating. Supposedly, my cameras violated the privacy of HOA board members during their official rounds. The claim was laughable, but the implication was clear. They didn't want to be watched. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across the cul-de-sac, I reviewed my camera footage from the past month. I wasn't looking for trouble. Not yet. But I found it anyway. The footage revealed something odd. A figure in a dark hoodie, moving deliberately from porch to porch late at night, occasionally stopping to pick something up. The movements weren't random. They were practiced. Whoever it was, they knew exactly where to go. My curiosity sharpened into suspicion when I zoomed in on one frame. The hood had slipped back just enough to reveal part of a face, one I recognized. It was a member of the HOA board, the very same treasurer who often boasted about keeping the neighborhood secure. A strange combination of anger and adrenaline surged through me. This wasn't just about a petty rule anymore. This was about someone using the HOA's authority as a shield, while they quietly victimized their own neighbors. The demand to remove my cameras suddenly made perfect sense. Those lenses were a threat to their side business. I knew I couldn't act rashly. The footage alone wasn't enough to make an airtight case. I needed more proof, more angles, more clarity. That meant leaving the cameras exactly where they were, no matter how many notices showed up on my door. For the next few nights, I stayed up later than usual, watching the live feed from my cameras in one window on my computer while pretending to do paperwork in another. It was tedious, but I was hunting for a pattern, a specific time, a specific route, anything that could predict the thief's movements. By the fourth night, I had one. The treasurer seemed to strike every 3 nights, always after 1 a.m. and always on the far side of the neighborhood, before working their way back toward their own home. The method was careful. Gloves, hood up, never lingering too long in one spot. But no amount of planning could hide from multiple camera angles. I began to widen my scope, reaching out discreetly to 2 neighbors I trusted. They agreed to point their own home cameras toward the street for a week, just to see what turned up. They didn't need to know the full plan yet, only that something strange was happening and that I had a reason to believe the HOA board was involved. The following Friday, I got exactly what I'd been waiting for. Clear footage from 3 different angles showed the treasurer lifting packages from a porch, tucking them into a large tote bag, and then calmly walking away like nothing had happened. The resolution was crisp enough to see the lettering on the tote, an embroidered monogram of their initials. But while my plan to expose them was taking shape, so was theirs. The very next morning, I received a final notice. My cameras were to be removed within 48 hours, or the HOA would escalate to legal enforcement. The letter was signed not just by the president, but also by the treasurer, the thief themselves. The stage was set for a confrontation, but I wasn't ready to make my move just yet. I needed the perfect moment, one where there would be no doubt, no excuse, and no way for them to wriggle free. And as luck, or maybe fate, would have it, that moment was coming sooner than I thought. Chapter 2. The Trap is Set. The final notice from the HOA sat on my kitchen counter like a challenge. I couldn't ignore. 48 hours to remove the cameras or face legal enforcement. They might as well have written, 48 hours until we can keep stealing without being caught. The arrogance behind it only solidified my resolve. I wasn't taking them down. In fact, I was going to make the cameras work harder than ever. But catching a thief in the act required more than just filming them. It required timing, bait, and witnesses who couldn't be accused of bias. The first step was the bait. I went to the local hardware store and bought 3 plain cardboard boxes, each about the size of a medium package delivery. Inside, I placed inexpensive household items that would look tempting, enough to steal, but wouldn't cost me much if they disappeared. An old cordless drill, a decorative lamp base, and a box of outdated electronics cables. On the outside, I printed professional-looking shipping, labels using a fake online order generator. They looked authentic enough that even the most paranoid neighbor would think they were real deliveries. That night, I placed 1 box on my porch, 1 on my neighbor's porch across the street, and 1 further down the block on the porch of a retired couple who had agreed to help. Each box was positioned within the direct line of sight of a security camera. The plan was simple: wait for the treasurer to make their usual late-night run, then capture the theft from multiple angles in perfect clarity. But I wanted more than just video proof. I wanted them caught red-handed with no chance to hide behind lies or intimidation. That meant getting law enforcement involved at exactly the right moment. I contacted a trusted officer from the local precinct, someone I knew personally and who wasn't connected to the HOA in any way. I explained what I had and what I expected to happen. He agreed to set up a discreet patrol car nearby on the 2 nights. The thief was most likely to strike. The waiting was the hardest part. Every creak of the house, every passing car made my pulse quicken. But I stayed focused, monitoring the live feeds, while keeping my phone ready to send the signal to the patrol officer. On the second night, just after 1 a.m., the familiar shadow appeared at the edge of the street. Hood up, gloves on, tote bag slung over one shoulder, the treasurer. They moved with the same quiet confidence as before, crossing the street diagonally to avoid the brightest pool of light from the street lamp. First, they approached my neighbor's porch. I watched their gloved hands reach for the box, casually glancing around before tucking it under one arm and moving on. The second stop was the retired couple's porch. Another quick grab, another addition to the tote. And then, as if it was routine, they made their way toward my house. My heart was pounding, but I kept still. When their hand closed around the box on my porch, I sent the silent text to the patrol officer waiting around the corner. Less than 30 seconds later, headlights swept across the street, followed by the brief burst of red and blue lights before going dark again. The patrol car rolled in quietly, blocking the end of the street. From my upstairs window, I could see the treasurer freeze, box still in hand. The officer stepped out, calm but authoritative, shining a flashlight directly into their face. It was the kind of moment you couldn't argue your way out of. The stolen boxes, the gloves, the tote bag with other packages inside. I didn't go outside. I didn't need to. The cameras had captured every step, from the moment they appeared on the street to the instant they were stopped by the patrol officer. The footage was crystal clear, backed by timestamps and multiple camera perspectives. By the time the officer placed the treasurer in the back of the patrol car, 2 of my neighbors had come outside, awakened by the commotion. They saw the scene for themselves, adding another layer of witnesses to the growing pile of evidence. The officer drove away without much fanfare. But the impact on the neighborhood was immediate. Lights flicked on in houses up and down the street. People gathered in small clusters, whispering. Some looked shocked. Others looked like they'd been waiting for this to happen. An hour later, my phone buzzed with a message from the officer. The treasurer had been booked for theft, and the stolen packages, not just mine, but others from past incidents, had been recovered from their garage. It was everything I had hoped for. But as satisfying as it was, I knew this wasn't over. HOA politics had a way of twisting even the clearest truths. And if the treasurer had been stealing for months, maybe even years, they weren't acting alone. The board's next meeting was in less than a week. And I had a feeling that when I walked into that room with my footage, I wouldn't just be exposing one person, I'd be kicking a hornet's nest wide open. Chapter 3. The Board Strikes Back. The days leading up to the HOA board meeting were eerily quiet. No more violation notices appeared on my door. No neighborly small talk at the mailbox. Even the usual gossipers seemed to keep their distance. It was the kind of silence that doesn't come from peace. It comes from people preparing for something. The arrest of the treasurer had spread faster than wildfire. By the morning after it happened, half the neighborhood knew someone from the HOA. Board had been caught stealing packages. By the second day, everyone knew it was the treasurer. Yet despite the evidence, the arrest, and the witness accounts, I started hearing whispers that the charges might not stick, that the whole thing was a misunderstanding, that maybe the cameras had misinterpreted what they saw. That last part made my stomach turn. Cameras don't misinterpret. People do, especially when it's convenient. It didn't take long to realize where the counter-narrative was coming from. The HOA president himself had begun making rounds, knocking on doors, spinning a story that the treasurer had been retrieving packages for safekeeping. After noticing suspicious activity in the neighborhood, the fact that the supposed retriever was walking around at 1 in the morning with a tote bag, full of unopened boxes apparently, didn't matter to him. The board meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening in the small community hall near the park. I arrived. Early camera bag slung over my shoulder, laptop under my arm. I wanted to make sure I had the best seat in the room, one where everyone could see what I was about to show them. When I walked in, the atmosphere was thick. The room wasn't full yet, but the board members were already clustered together at the front, speaking in low, tight tones. The treasurer's seat was conspicuously empty, but the nameplate remained. A small, deliberate reminder that they weren't willing to erase one of their own just yet. Neighbors began filing in. Some avoided my eyes. Others gave me small, supportive nods. It was clear that this meeting wasn't going to be routine. The normal agenda, lawn care updates, budget reviews, community events, was just window dressing. Everyone knew the real reason they were here. When the meeting started, the president went through the motions, droning on about landscaping contracts and trash pickup schedules. It felt like watching a magician wave his hands to distract from what was in the other pocket. But eventually, the inevitable came up. Before we move on, the president began, his voice carefully measured. I need to address an unfortunate misunderstanding that occurred earlier this week involving one of our board members. Misunderstanding. The word landed like a slap. He spun the same story I'd heard whispered, that the treasurer had been assisting in securing unattended deliveries, and that the arrest had been the result of a miscommunication with local authorities. He even went as far as to suggest that the incident was exacerbated by certain residents who had illegally surveilled the neighborhood without proper HOA clearance. That last part was aimed squarely at me. When he finished, he looked around the room as if expecting murmurs of agreement. Instead, there was an uncomfortable silence. A few people shifted in their seats. One woman in the back crossed her arms and narrowed her eyes. That was my moment. I stood up, moved to the projector station, and without waiting for permission, connected my laptop to the HDMI cable. The footage from my cameras filled the screen, are crisp, time-stamped, and undeniable. 3 angles, all showing the treasurer moving from porch to porch, lifting packages and tucking them into the tote bag. The final clip showed the patrol officer stopping them at the end of the street, the stolen boxes clearly visible. The room went dead quiet. I let the footage play twice, no commentary, no dramatic pauses, just facts. When it ended, I closed my laptop and stood still for a moment. The president's face had tightened. His attempt at damage control was unraveling in real time. He mumbled something about context and review, but the words felt hollow. Neighbors who had been silent before were now speaking up, asking pointed questions. How long had this been going on? Why hadn't the HOA addressed the earlier theft complaints? And why, if the treasurer was securing packages, were they doing it in the middle of the night without notifying anyone? The president deflected, dodged, and in some cases outright ignored the questions. But the more he tried to steer the conversation away, the more obvious it became that this wasn't just about one board member. As the meeting wound down, the president announced that the treasurer had voluntarily stepped back from their duties pending the outcome of the investigation. But the choice of words was telling. He hadn't resigned. He hadn't been removed. And the president had no intention of letting this incident break the board's grip on the neighborhood. When I left the hall that night, I knew the battle had just begun. I had exposed the thief, but in doing so, I had also exposed the lengths the board would go to protect their own. And as I walked back to my house, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Another yellow envelope taped to my door. Chapter 4, Retaliation in the Shadows. The yellow envelope on my door that night felt different from the others. The first ones had been printed on official HOA letterhead, stiff and formal. This one looked rushed, the paper slightly crumpled, the text uneven as if it had been run off an old home printer. It wasn't just a notice, it was a warning. The letter claimed I was in violation of multiple community guidelines, listing vague infractions, like failure to maintain visual harmony and disruption of board operations. The wording was deliberately broad, impossible to pin down to any specific act. But the final line was crystal clear. Continued noncompliance will result in escalation to full legal review. It was an empty threat, at least on the surface. But I knew the board well enough to understand that they weren't going to challenge me in open daylight anymore. The treasurer's arrest had made public confrontation too risky. No, they'd operate in the shadows now, striking in ways that wouldn't be obvious to outsiders, but would make daily life just a little more difficult. The first strike came within 48 hours. My mailbox, normally filled with the usual mix of bills and junk flyers, was suddenly empty 3 days in a row. When I checked with the post office, they told me delivery to my address had been temporarily suspended due to a reported safety concern. No one could explain exactly what that meant or who had made the report. But reinstating service would take at least a week. Next came the trash collection. My bins, lined up neatly at the curb like always, were left untouched while every other house on the street had theirs emptied. When I called the waste management company, they claimed my service had been paused at the homeowner's request. I hadn't made any such request. It didn't take a detective to connect the dots. Each inconvenience was small enough to seem like a mix-up. But together they formed a pattern. The board, or someone acting on their behalf, was using every petty channel available to make my life harder. The strange part was, my cameras weren't catching anything unusual at night. No trespassers, no one tampering with my property. Whoever was pulling the strings was doing it with phone calls, emails, and paperwork. Attacks that left no physical trace, but carried very real consequences. I decided to document everything. Every letter, every delay, every unexplained service disruption went into a folder, complete with dates and names of any employees I spoke to. If they wanted to play a slow game of attrition, I'd make sure every move was recorded. But the real blow came a week later when I received a certified letter, this time an official one, complete with the HOA's seal. It informed me that due to continued non-compliance and behavior detrimental to the community's cohesion, the board was recommending a lien be placed on my property for unpaid fines. The total? Over $4,200. It was a number pulled from thin air. I had never agreed to any of the violations they claimed, and I certainly hadn't ignored legitimate fines. But a lien wasn't something I could ignore. Left unchecked, it could complicate refinancing, property sales, even my credit. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. The treasurer's preliminary court date was approaching, and the board was trying to discredit me ahead of it. If they could paint me as a problem resident in official records, it would be easier to cast doubt on my motives and undermine my credibility. The problem for them was, I wasn't alone anymore. In the week since the arrest, neighbors who had been quiet at first were starting to talk. A few came forward with their own stories, unexplained fines, retaliation after questioning board decisions, even rumors of missing funds from the HOA's budget. The more I listened, the more it became clear that the theft wasn't just about packages. It was part of a larger rot at the core of the board's leadership. I began meeting with a small group in secret, 5 neighbors, who were just as fed up as I was. We started cross-referencing our violation notices, bank statements from HOA dues, and even old meeting minutes. Patterns emerged. Dates lined up. And more than once, the same names kept appearing in connection, with questionable decisions and missing money. It was no longer just about clearing my name or exposing the treasurer. This was about dismantling an entire network of abuse of power. But to do that, I needed something bigger than neighborhood gossip. I needed hard proof, the kind that wouldn't just hold up in a community meeting, but in court. One night, as I sifted through my files, I realized I already had the beginnings of that proof. Not from my cameras, but from the board's own public records. Every HOA was required by law to keep certain documents available for homeowner review, including budgets, expense reports, and meeting minutes. And if those documents didn't match the reality of where the money was going, the fallout could be devastating for the people involved. The trick was getting access without tipping them off. I decided to bide my time until the next board meeting. If I played my cards right, I could request the documents in a way that made it seem like a casual homeowner inquiry, all while knowing exactly what I was looking for. The challenge would be walking into that room with a calm face, knowing full well that the people across from me had already tried to ruin my life. And as I prepared for that meeting, a thought kept pressing at the back of my mind. If the treasurer was just the one caught in the act, what exactly were the others hiding that was worth this level of retaliation? I had a feeling I was about to find out, and that it would be worse than I imagined. Chapter 5. Digging into the Ledger. The next board meeting came on a windy Thursday evening, the kind where loose branches scrape. Along fences and the air carries a restless kind of energy. I arrived early not to socialize, but to position myself where I could see the board's faces clearly. It wasn't paranoia anymore, it was strategy. When the meeting officially began, the president went through the agenda with his usual monotone, pretending nothing had happened in recent weeks. No mention of the treasurer's court date, no mention of the arrest, not a word about the lien they'd tried to slap on my property. It was all community wellness initiatives and upcoming landscaping improvements. When the open homeowner comment period came, I raised my hand casually and requested access to the HOA's last 3 years of financial statements, expense reports, and meeting minutes. I framed it as personal curiosity and wanting to better understand where my dues go. The president's reaction was a split-second flicker of discomfort before he forced a smile. He assured me that, of course, those documents are available upon request, and promised to have copies prepared by the following week. I left the meeting without pushing further. The less they suspected my true intentions, the better. 7 days later, I walked into the HOA's small office and was handed a thick binder. The secretary, who kept her eyes down the entire time, didn't make small talk. The binder was heavier than expected, not just because of paper, but because of what I suspected it contained. Back home, I cleared my dining table and started going through it page by page. At first, it was the usual: line item budgets, maintenance expenses, landscaping fees. But as I dug deeper, I noticed patterns that didn't sit right. Certain vendor payments recurred every month, always for round numbers on $1,000 here, $2,500 there, but with no attached invoices or work descriptions. The payees were listed under vague names like Community Services LLC or Neighborhood Improvements Co. A quick online search turned up nothing for those companies. No websites, no business registrations in the state database. They didn't exist. Then there were the reimbursements. Multiple payments to board members for materials and event expenses, often in cash. No receipts, no supporting documents. And the amounts were just small enough to avoid triggering mandatory audits, but frequent enough to add up to thousands over the course of a year. The deeper I went, the more I realized this wasn't sloppy bookkeeping, it was deliberate obfuscation. The treasurer's thefts from porches were almost petty compared to what was happening in the ledger. Money was vanishing, funneled through phantom vendors and undocumented reimbursements. One entry in particular made my blood run cold. A $7,800 payment to Community Services LLC, dated just 2 weeks before the treasurer's arrest. The check had been authorized by both the treasurer and the president. The signature lines were clear, undeniable. I started cross-referencing the dates of these suspicious payments with the HOA's meeting minutes. That's when I found something even more damning. On the dates where large, unexplained payments went out, the minutes always reflected executive session discussions. Private board-only segments where no homeowners were present and no details were recorded. Those executive sessions were being used to greenlight transactions without scrutiny. It was a closed loop of control. The board voted in private. The treasurer moved the money, and the records were vague enough that no casual glance would raise suspicion. But I wasn't looking casually. I was looking for exactly this. I made digital scans of every questionable entry, highlighting amounts, dates, and signatures. I organized them into a timeline that made the flow of money crystal clear. I wasn't an accountant, but even to an untrained eye, the pattern screamed fraud. The next step was deciding where to take it. A regular homeowner complaint wouldn't cut it. The board would bury it, just as they'd buried other issues. This needed to go beyond the neighborhood. I called the same officer who had helped me catch the treasurer and explained what I had found. He put me in touch with a financial crimes investigator at the county level. When I met with the investigator 2 days later, I laid out the binder, the scans, and the timeline on his desk. He barely looked up as he flipped through the pages, but his pen started moving quickly across a notepad. When he finally looked at me, his words were simple but telling. "You've got something here. And if this holds up, it's not just theft. It's organized." The county's financial crimes unit opened a quiet investigation. I was instructed not to tip anyone off, not even the neighbors I'd been working with. The investigator explained that cases like this took time. Every transaction had to be traced. Every vendor name checked, every bank record subpoenaed. But once they had enough, it could move fast. In the meantime, I had to act normal. Smile at the neighbors. Wave at board members if they passed. Pretend the lien and the harassment weren't eating at the edges of my patience. The board thought they had control of the narrative. They had no idea a bigger storm was building just beyond their line of sight. As I packed the binder back into its box that night, a single thought solidified in my mind. The treasurer was only the first domino. When the rest fell, it wouldn't just be one arrest. It would be the collapse of the board itself. And that collapse was coming sooner than they thought. Chapter 6. The Courtroom Break. The investigation moved quietly but steadily. I knew something was happening when the board's tone began to change. The president, who once puffed himself up like a miniature dictator at every meeting, had started avoiding eye contact. The secretary no longer greeted me with clipped politeness. She simply busied herself with papers whenever I walked in. And the vice president, normally the loudest supporter of new community projects, had gone completely silent on social media. The county's financial crimes investigator called one evening, his voice calm but deliberate. "We're ready," he said. "You're going to be subpoenaed as a witness. The case will be presented before a grand jury next month. After that, charges." It felt like the air around me got heavier. This was no longer neighborhood, gossip, or petty feuding. It was about to be a formal criminal proceeding. The binder of ledgers I had picked apart at my dining table was about to become a key piece of evidence in a courtroom. When the day of the grand jury came, I wasn't allowed inside the chamber, but I waited nearby. Hours passed. The investigator finally emerged with a measured smile. "Indictments," he said. "Multiple." The treasurer's arrest had been a spectacle. This was more of a quiet implosion. The president, vice president, and treasurer were all formally charged with embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy to commit theft. The phantom vendor payments, the reimbursements without receipts, the executive session authorizations, all of it was laid bare in black and white. The case moved faster than anyone expected. Within weeks, the first hearing was scheduled. I sat in the back row of the courtroom, dressed plainly, watching as the once powerful board members shuffled in with their attorneys. Their confident, domineering postures were gone, replaced by tense shoulders and downward stares. The prosecution's opening statement was methodical. They didn't just accuse, they laid out a narrative. Every unexplained payment had a date. Every executive session had a corresponding check. Every vendor was proven to be non-existent. It was a puzzle, and the prosecutors slid each piece into place with deliberate precision. I listened as my own scans and notes were entered into evidence. The prosecutor referred to me only as a concerned homeowner, never by name, keeping my involvement as quiet as possible to avoid backlash. Still, I could feel the occasional sideways glance from the defense table. They knew. The defense attorneys tried to argue that the payments were for verbal contracts, or emergency maintenance that didn't require documentation, but without proof those arguments crumbled. One attorney even suggested that the treasurer had acted alone, forging signatures to authorize payments, but the prosecution countered with handwriting analysis and bank records, showing multiple board members signing off on transactions. At one point, the county investigator took the stand and described how the board had effectively operated as a closed circle, approving and processing their own expenses without oversight. He called it a textbook example of internal collusion in a small-scale governing body. The tension in the room thickened with each witness. You could almost feel the weight of years of manipulation and greed pressing down on the defendants. The prosecutor wasn't asking for minor penalties. They were seeking felony convictions and restitution for the entire stolen amount. When it was my turn to testify, I kept my answers factual. I described how the HOA had tried to force me to remove my security cameras, how those cameras had captured the treasurer stealing packages, and how that incident led to my deeper review of the financial records. I didn't embellish. I didn't gloat. The facts spoke for themselves. By the end of the first week of hearings, it was clear the defense was running out of ground to stand on. Two of the defendants were openly avoiding each other in the courtroom, their attorneys arguing separate strategies. It was the beginning of a split, and when co-defendants turn on each other, the case usually unravels faster. The judge announced that sentencing, if convictions were reached, would likely include not just prison time but mandatory repayment of misappropriated funds. The number being discussed in court, more than $120,000 I made. Several neighbors in the gallery audibly gasped. It was more money than most of us had imagined. As court adjourned one afternoon, I walked past the defendants without a word. They didn't look at me. They didn't have to. The balance of power had shifted entirely. The same board that once thought they could control me with fines and intimidation now stood on the brink of losing everything, their positions, their reputations, and their freedom. Still, the case wasn't over. The verdict was yet to be read, and there was always a chance for appeals, legal maneuvering, and last-minute deals. But one thing was certain. Whatever happened next would change the neighborhood forever. The storm I'd been waiting for wasn't just on the horizon anymore. It was here, filling the air with the charged stillness that comes just before the final crash. Chapter 7. The Final Unraveling. The day of the verdict felt unreal. The courtroom was packed tighter than any neighborhood meeting had ever been. People who hadn't attended an HOA gathering in years had shown up, curious to see the final act of a drama that had gripped the entire subdivision. You could hear the low hum of whispered speculation, broken only by the occasional shuffle of papers from the court clerk. The defendants sat at the front, each separated by their attorneys. Weeks of hearings had stripped them of any hint of authority. Their posture was slouched, their expressions stiff. They weren't the polished, self-assured board members who once dictated what color you could paint your mailbox. They were just people waiting to be judged. When the jury filed back into the room, the tension was so heavy it seemed to slow time. The foreman stood holding the verdict form, his eyes forward. For the treasurer, guilty on all counts, embezzlement, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit theft. For the president, guilty on all counts, aiding and abetting, conspiracy, misuse of public trust. For the vice president, guilty on conspiracy and fraud, not guilty on one lesser count of falsifying records. Gasps rippled through the gallery. The sound wasn't loud, but it carried, like the release of a collective breath. The judge wasted little time. Sentencing was set for 2 weeks later, but bail was immediately revoked for the treasurer and president. The bailiff moved in, and the sight of two once feared community leaders being handcuffed in front of everyone struck deeper than any HOA fine ever could. They were led out through the side door, disappearing from the room like shadows pulled out of the light. In the days that followed, the neighborhood buzzed with a strange mix of relief and reckoning. Without the board's core, the HOA was essentially leaderless. Emergency elections were called. And for the first time in years, people who had avoided HOA politics were volunteering. I was asked repeatedly if I would run for a seat, but I declined. I hadn't fought this battle to take their place. I just wanted the rot cut out so the community could breathe again. At sentencing, the judge's tone was stern, almost surgical. The treasurer received 6 years in state prison and was ordered to pay full restitution of $78,000. The president was given 5 years with partial restitution of $30,000. The vice president, spared prison time due to a plea deal, was sentenced to 2 years of probation and barred from holding any position in a governing body for a decade. The restitution payments would be slow, and some of the stolen money would never truly return. But the principle had been set in stone. The HOA was not untouchable. After the dust settled, I kept my cameras up, legally and visibly. Neighbors who once kept their distance now stopped by to talk, sometimes just to say thank you. Package thefts vanished. The petty fines stopped. The community newsletter even shifted tone, focusing on actual improvements instead of constant threats of violation notices. The HOA's rules about security cameras were quietly removed from the bylaws, replaced with clear protections for homeowners' right to secure their property. Ironically, the very thing they tried to ban was now written into the foundation of our community's governance. Months later, I would sometimes walk past the old board meeting hall, the same room where they once tried to humiliate me into compliance. It stood empty most days, its glass doors reflecting the street back at me. There was no gavel banging, no smug grins from the head of the table, just silence. The cameras I'd refused to take down were still watching over my home, just as they had from the start. But now they also stood as a quiet reminder. Power only lasts as long as people are willing to let it. The HOA had tried to control me. Instead, they destroyed themselves. Thank you so much for watching this video. Your time and support mean the world to us, and we truly appreciate you being part of our growing community. Every view, like, and comment encourages us to keep creating stories and content that you enjoy. If you liked what you saw today, don't forget to hit the like button. It helps us reach more amazing viewers like you. We'd love to hear your thoughts, opinions, or personal experiences related to the topic in the comments section below. Your feedback not only inspires us, but also sparks great discussions among our viewers. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an upload. We post fresh, engaging content regularly, and we don't want you to miss a thing. Sharing this video with friends and family is another great way to help support the channel. Once again, thank you for being here. You're the reason we can keep doing what we love. Stay tuned for our next video. Until then, take care, stay safe, and keep being awesome.